Hey, you. Welcome to the podcast. Not entirely sure what I'll be calling it yet, but by the time this is released, I'm sure it will have a name. My name's David, and I'd like to go over just a few things before we get started and just set up a standard format that this podcast will follow from here on out. The first will be just going over some quick business. Next, after that, I will set an intention for this podcast. And then finally, I'll introduce my guest. So, first, some quick business. This podcast is sponsored by me. I am currently paying for whatever needs arise, but I am taking a risk, or what I think is a risk for myself, because I don't feel entirely comfortable with it, but I would like to put myself out there and see what the universe brings back. And in that regard, I've started a Patreon account where, if you feel so inclined, you may give some scraps, some small earnings my way in order to sustainably fund this podcast. And we'll see where that goes. I'll share via this post in some description a link to that Patreon. And if you want to give, great. If you don't want to give, I completely understand as well. I'm just happy to share this experience and continue to experiment. All right, well, that's the quick business. Next, I want to set an intention. I'd like the podcast to be informational. I'd like you guys to feel like you're getting something out of this, and it's not just me speaking, that I'm delivering, that me and my guests are delivering some value for you, and that you walk away feeling like you've gained something. I'd like it also to be somewhat vulnerable, that we're going outside of our comfort zones and saying things that maybe we don't feel entirely comfortable with, but are necessary in order to get to the truth of things. And finally, I'd like it to be fun, so that we're laughing and playing and just enjoying this experience. And so, yeah, I think that's a short intention that I'd like to set. And on to my first guest. My first guest is one of my favorite people on the earth. And I really wanted to have him as my first podcast guest, just because we have a lot of shared experience together. His name is Bradley Lovell. Lovell, rather. Jeez, he's not gonna be happy about that one. But the two of us went to college together. We were actually in the same fraternity. And so he'll explain kind of what that was like to be in a fraternity. And some years later, we would go on to hike a long-distance trail together called the Pacific Crest Trail. And so, yeah, I just spent 6 months with him during that time. And that we don't get into so much in this podcast. That will have to be another episode for another time. More so, we dug into his current state of affairs, which is living at a meditation center. He's been there for the last 3 years, more or less. And what that's been like for him. He's spent a lot of time in silence and looking within himself, and he'll explain what that means. And yeah, I had a lot of fun. We had a lot of fun discussing this. And I think he has a lot to say. And this podcast almost didn't happen. I do want to tell that story very quickly, that I don't have internet in my house, and Bradley does not live where I live in Austin. And so a quick shout out to Kendra and Tyson and their household for allowing me to barge on in and to use their house to make this interview happen. But yeah, very grateful that this did happen. I guess it was meant to be. All right, you guys. Well, that's enough of all that. That'll be the standard format from now on. But without further ado, here's Bradley. All right, Bradley. Thanks for coming on, my brother. It's good to see you. It's good to hear from you. And just wanted to start out by, there's a lot to get into. But I think a good place to start would be just giving the audience and giving the listeners a good overview of your story and where you've come from. In particular, it wasn't that many years ago that we were both in college together and living the fraternity life. So I guess my first question is, like, how would you describe yourself back in those college days? And it seemed like you were pretty well on your way to becoming, to live the corporate life and to become a currency exchange broker, or to work for a currency exchange brokerage. What happened to that?
Oh, good question, because I was going to start much earlier and ask where to burrow down into, but let's just get started in college. I would characterize myself as an arrogant, funny, manipulative, and outgoing person in college. Yeah, those traits had been with me for some time. And yeah, that would be how I would describe myself back then. In college, it was lauded to have these traits, really, especially in the campus we were at. So yeah, that would be how I would describe myself back then. And but level-headed as well. I'd say I was pretty level-headed. I remember a lot of people were getting blackout drunk, doing all these things, and I would also participate in these activities and have a lot of fun with it. But I always remember kind of keeping an even keel with it. I was not the type of person to get so plastered that I wasn't going to remember the next day. And even during it, people generally would not recognize if I was drunk or not, even if I was. So I had kind of an even keel with that. And I did actually end up working for a currency brokerage pretty shortly after college. I'd say a big part of what knocked me out of that was psychedelics. Taking psychedelics gave me a new reference point, that there were different states of mind, of consciousness, and I was very eager to access these states in a more natural way. and was convinced that it could be done. So as I started diving into that world a little more, the mundane world lost its luster, starting to see through veils like money and government, and really just developed a kind of an acidic attitude towards these things, unhealthily acidic. And so the quest for balance continued from there.
Mm. And so how deep did you go into psychedelics at that point in your life?
Well, David, you know me. I'm kind of an extreme person. So I took it pretty deep. I would go out into the woods with a couple friends, and we were growing them at the time, but we would take anywhere from 5 grams to half an ounce of mushrooms and blast off, as they say. But I took that journey all the way to Peru to do ayahuasca, and was really convinced actually that going down there and doing that would be what I was seeking. That would be the end all, the
Yeah.
climax of this sojourn. And of course it wasn't. I had paid for 5 ceremonies in the remote Amazonian jungle with a native family, and on the 4th ceremony, the message was abundantly clear that there is nothing external that is going to give you what you want. Nothing external is going to give you happiness.
Mm.
And so that launched into a new leg of the journey, more of an inward journey at that point.
Mm. Okay. Wow. Yeah, man. So you said it was pretty clear that, these insights that you got from taking these psychedelics was that this is not the path. Why do you say that? Was there an inner voice telling you that, or you just weren't getting what you expected out of it?
Good question. It was really an intuitive knowing, maybe coupled with a voice, but I don't think it was my voice, or at least it wasn't the internal voice that I normally identify with. So, but it was really this intuitive sense, like it's not going to come from outside. There's no shortcuts. Any sort of insights that I was gathering with these psychedelics were totally ephemeral, and generally left, a sour taste after, a couple days. These true insights were not earned, and therefore I had no vessel to really integrate them into my life. So yeah, the quest was to really figure out how I can gain these insights but keep them. And I realized that you have to earn them, or I have to earn them to keep them.
Mm. Okay, so you felt like in the moment while you were taking them, like, okay, this is real, and important, but I want to be able to hold on to this in a more tangible way that's not just fleeting and externally induced.
Right.
Okay.
I remember one time in Oklahoma, we were in this wildlife refuge, and we had taken a bunch of mushrooms at night, a big tea. And I remember my mind quieting down, and then the chatting starting, and that oscillating, and then me figuring out how to keep it down and keep the chatter off. And it was really to not take it all so seriously. As soon as I started laughing at it, my mind would shut off. And then when I wanted it, it would start clinging, and that cycle would start all over again. So, but yeah, I don't mean to denounce or berate psychedelics in any way. I think they're a big part of my own personal journey. However, they are not the end. And I've seen too many times where people will think that it's the end and stop there and just use that over and over. Um, so
Mm,
there was a purpose, but like any tool, it's got to be let go of.
yeah, cool. And so then what led you to your next step in life? I'm imagining you like working this corporate job, experimenting with psychedelics. And I mean, I guess at this point though, you've left the job, you've traveled to the jungles, and you've taken ayahuasca and you're realizing like, okay, this isn't necessarily the path that I want to be on. There's more out there. What sparked the next step to either leave the jungle or to go searching for how did you find that next step in life?
Well, before I actually left to South America, I had set up a job already in the Antarctic region of Chile, southern Patagonia. So I knew what I was doing right after that. Um, so we left the jungle, and I say we because I was with a good friend of mine, and we started heading down south. And I got to tell you, I was pretty disenchanted. I really thought that this ayahuasca was going to flip the switch for me, and
Mm,
I was going to be, very happy and content after having gone through this. And that wasn't the case. It really just brought me to a new baseline. And
mm,
so I started to just continue to do more research and just stay open to whatever it was. I knew I was wanting to go inward, but as many seekers know, they hear these cliches like it's all inside. Just go inside. You'll find it all in
yeah,
there,
yeah, yeah.
right? But there's nothing practical behind that. Like, what do you mean go inside? Yes, I can intellectually understand that, but I don't know what that really means in a pragmatic way. So, um, in Chile, a Dutch or German man, I was having breakfast with him, and we were talking about consciousness and getting into these deeper philosophical conversations. And he mentioned this thing called the presence process, written by a teacher from South Africa named Michael Brown, who wrote a book. And it's essentially a 10-week program where you begin to meditate, focusing on your breath twice a day. And you say a mantra to yourself throughout the day as often as you remember. There's a different mantra every week of the 10 weeks. And he just guides you through different aspects of going inside yourself and what that means. One key feature that I remember learning was that the world is a mirror. So when
Mm,
people start pissing me off or triggering me, I really started to understand that as, oh, this is bringing something up in me. This is my reaction, and this is just the vehicle outside. And to be upset of the vehicle is really just a waste of energy. So, and it was a big commitment. I mean, if you don't have a formal sitting practice and to start sitting for 15 minutes twice a day, um, that was pretty serious. And to go totally sober as well. So I went and jumped into that and did that probably 2 or 3 times, and was ready for something more. Thought that this was a little elementary at this point, that I needed to take it to another level.
mm.
So,
Okay, so he introduced you to this book, The Presence Process, and that kind of got you started with a little bit more practical stuff rather than just cliches. And so then what led you, I guess, to the life you're living right now, which is meditation? Um, did it require more conversations, more research?
Yeah, I think that quest continued by falling off the wagon. I'd fall off the wagon, stop meditating, and come back on and reinvigorate my practice and start meditating again, and then fall off again, fall into old habits, kind of this oscillation, back and forth,
Mm.
um, and really just gaining the wisdom of what it's like when I'm meditating and sober, and what it's like when I'm not meditating and smoking dope or whatever it is. So that oscillation lasted for probably 2 years or so, and a few countries and a few thousand miles, something like that, which we might get into.
uh, yeah, yeah, definitely. Um, and so would you say, because before, so this is, I mean, I guess around the year 2013 or so. Um, because I do remember you showing me this book, like The Presence Process, or presenting
Mm,
it to me in some way. And I was like, okay, or maybe I just saw that you were reading it. And I was like, all right, that's interesting. And I might have dove into it a little bit, but I don't think I was, it didn't really appeal to me at the time. I don't know if I was ready.
yeah.
Um, but I do remember, for sure, like when I had lost my job, or rather I'd quit my job, and this was 2015 at this point, 2 years out of college. I'd quit my job and was hoping to have secured another job, but that job fell through. And that's when I called you, and just like other friends, just looking around, like, what are my options right now? And at this point, I was like getting more and more disillusioned with that life, with accumulation, with just like the corporate lifestyle. And I remember you telling me about the trail for the first time in 2015, and the Pacific Crest Trail, and what it was kind of about. What led you to that, to learning more about that, and thinking that there could be something in that might not exist on the path of meditation?
Well, I love answering this question because if any PCT hikers listening to this, I first got inspired by reading the book Wild while I was in South America. And that's a little bit of an inside joke to those that were hiking the PCT. But yeah, I remember reading that and just really resonating with this idea of pilgrimage. And if anyone's read that book, it's a great book. And I think a lot of people were disappointed on the PCT because there wasn't enough about the PCT on it, et cetera, or that she didn't do the whole trail. But I see that book as it's really a woman's journey, a pilgrimage with the PCT simply as a setting. Um, and the idea of launching myself into the unknown was just more and more appealing after leaving to South America, not really knowing what to expect, and really growing a lot from that. Just, where can I, or how can I do this again in an even bigger and more challenging way? How can I push my envelope even more? And so that planted a seed, and then in 2015, it finally ripened. Um, but to answer your question, I took my first Vipassana course in the SN Goenka tradition in 2015, knowing that I was going to hike the Pacific Crest Trail. And so I wanted to have that kind of experience under my belt and then go into the Pacific Crest Trail as a meditative experience, which isn't exactly what it turned out to be, but that was my original intention.
Yeah. Okay.
And then
And
you
so,
called. Yeah.
mhm. Well, I think we should back up maybe a little bit just for the listeners. What is Vipassana? What is the Goenka tradition? And maybe really quickly, just the PCT, the Pacific Crest Trail, is a trail in America on the West Coast, more or less, the Sierra Mountain Range, um, going through California, Oregon, and Washington. Um,
Californian.
California. That's right. So that's what we ended up doing in 2015. But if you want to explain your experience right before that with Vipassana and what that is.
Yeah, so I was in South America for about a year and a half, um, and I was in Chile for about a year of that, and then left to go to Argentina, and then went to Uruguay to meet up with another good friend, Alex Skold, um, which some of the listeners may know who that is. And then I came back here in 2014 of March, and again, this drive was eating at me. I had not found what I left to South America for. I was still seeking something and wasn't exactly sure what it was, but it was driving me forward. So I left on a bicycle to head west and rode out to Arkansas from Georgia and met up with another friend and just did this cross country traveling for a while. And it got me all the way out to Oregon, where I ended up on a pot farm, um, being a trimmigrant. And I just remember at that point, I started my practice up again and was starting to become pretty diligent after
Mm,
that. And this idea of going out into the woods became very prominent in my mind. How can I go out and just be silent? That's what I want. I just want to go out and just be silent for an extended period of time.
hmm
And I hitched a ride with this woman after I finished the season, the harvest season, and she mentioned Vipassana, that her boyfriend had done it. And as soon as she started explaining what it was, I said, "That's for me. That's for me." I knew it. So I signed up
Oh,
for a
wow.
course the next day, and then sat in Texas, January 1st, 2015. But just to give a brief synopsis of what Vipassana is, it's a Pali word, which means insight, and it means to see things as they are, not as we want them to be, but really as they are in their ultimate sense. Um, so in the SN Goenka tradition, the introductory courses are 10 days long, including 9 days of silence, where a participant is generally meditating from about 4:30 a.m. to 9 p.m. with some breaks littered in that space, um, and working on developing concentration for a few days, and then practicing actual Vipassana meditation, which is essentially observing bodily sensations and scanning the body in different ways, and developing equipoise or a objective attitude to all of these sensations, whether pleasant or unpleasant.
Mm.
So that's essentially what it is in a nutshell.
No, yeah, very well said. Um, Maybe we can explain also to the audience, what's the importance of observing one's sensations in particular, because I think that's fairly unique to the Vipassana tradition or technique. And so, like, why would anyone want to feel into their sensations and observe those, as opposed to just, you know, maybe putting your attention on the breath? What's the difference there?
Well, first of all, just there is a world going on inside that is extremely interesting when the mind gets concentrated enough to actually observe it. Um, so when we hear things like go inside, observe what's happening inside, this is what they're pointing to, the sensations that are happening at all times inside. And so the importance of that is, first of all, you're embodying yourself. Many of us are walking around, living our lives without any sense of what's going on inside. What am I actually feeling? What's driving my decisions? And as we go inside and start to feel these sensations, we start to get a better handle on what is driving our decisions. Why do I keep making these same mistakes? Why do I keep doing well in this particular area and failing in this particular area? All of these questions become a little clearer, or at least the answers do, when we start to feel what's going on inside our own bodies. So from that standpoint, it's very useful to start feeling what's going on inside the body. And from another perspective, once one starts going inside the body, they'll quickly understand that there are pleasant sensations and that there are very unpleasant sensations. And generally, we want these pleasant sensations to stick around for as long as possible and want these unpleasant sensations to go away as quickly as possible. But what Vipassana teaches us is that at an ultimate level, all of these sensations are just part of this flow of arising and passing, of impermanence, essentially. Everything that we know is changing at a very gross level, from what you're looking at around, always changing, to what's going on inside at a more subtle level, always changing. And because of this fact, this law that everything is changing, there is no point whatsoever in craving anything or having hatred towards anything, because it's all going to change. So what this teaches us, by going inside and observing these unpleasant things and being calm and not craving when these pleasant things arise, translates to outside. So we practice inside, and this has an immediate effect to our outside experience. That when unpleasant things happen, we now have greater wisdom, knowing that this will change. And with that wisdom, it's huge to have that insight. And I'll say that this insight is not a flashlight insight. This insight comes from bits and bits and bits of practice and experience within. It adds up. So it's not a lightning flash. I imagine it can happen at times, but for most people, it is experience after experience after experience, grain of sand after grain of sand, adding up. And slowly the mind starts to understand. So even if something unpleasant happens outside, something that we want doesn't happen, or something unwanted happens, then we can run into that situation with much more calm and poise. And because of that, we can actually handle the situation much better. So it has direct benefits, this idea of observing oneself inside.
Yeah, it does. I guess that leads me to, well, I was going to ask, do you remember the first time when you really experienced that yourself? But like you said, was it for you just these grains of salts, these grains of sand just piling onto each other, and like an accumulation of experiences? Because I can imagine that once one really gets a hold of that conceptual experience or that intellectual idea and really experiences it directly, then that kind of changes things for them. Does that make sense?
Yeah, absolutely. It does make sense. However, the mind, when we think of the mind, we think of just one entity, perhaps, or our mind. But that's not really that accurate. What's more accurate is that there are a bunch of minds within the mind. So there's a lot of different needs and wants of different parts of the mind, and they're generally competing for one another. And so when we have an experience where we recognize that everything is changing, that part of our mind might experience that. But there's a lot of other parts of our mind that may not be on board with that. So the idea is to keep experiencing that and understanding the changing nature of it all. That way, more and more parts of the mind get on board with it, get aligned, get synced up, and start to really understand this. I mean, these habit patterns that we have go very deep, very deep. And so even just one experience of that, whether at a gross or subtle level, is great. But it's generally going to take that experience over and over and over again before it really starts to crystallize in the mind.
Mm. Yeah, that's what I really feel like is my experience with the practice. Like, in that I have experienced this idea of like this feeling of change, that sensations and thoughts are arising and passing away. But, it's so easy to understand that at the intellectual level. But then when it comes down to, oh, something bad has happened in my life, something that I wanted has not happened, or something unwanted has happened, that it's so easy to just roll back into that misery, I guess. And that, like you said, this is just one part of my mind, or of our minds, that might have accepted that truth, but haven't really fully embodied it.
Mm, right.
Well, one question I had, Bradley, was like, you've been living this life as a monk, more or less, for 3 years now. When you come out into the world, what do you see from other people, or from yourself even? Like entering back into the mundane world. Yeah, do things become more obvious to you? Yeah, like what do you see? What do you see in the world when you come out?
Well, that too has kind of a changing nature to it. Sometimes the suffering in the world is glaringly obvious when I go outside into the mundane world. But I also see a lot of hope. There's a lot of kindness in the world, and so it's a mix. Just like my own habit patterns are a mix. It's totally a mix out there. I do find though that as I continue meditating more and more, that I can almost glide through experience in the mundane world, that I'm not as susceptible to be pulled in to other people's suffering. Okay? So
Mm.
if I'm dealing with someone, or just interacting with someone that's clearly, having a bad day or a bad year or a bad life, whatever it is, it's much easier now, and I'm still getting challenged, but it's much easier to maintain myself and not get drawn into that. And at times, draw them into my calmness, draw them into my appreciation for the opportunity we have, and to lift them up even momentarily. Um, so that becomes a lot of fun, because to me, the work that I'm doing is so much better when it can be shared. It's not just
Mm.
kept to me alone. Um,
Dude, that's
so
awesome.
yeah,
Like, what would you say some tips might be like, because I know what you're saying. Like, maybe these things just happen naturally, almost like because of your practice, right? But
yeah.
what practically are you doing when you're encountering like these negative energies, or just people's bad moments, to then bring them back and like show them love, I guess?
Yeah, well, there's a couple prerequisites. So, one, it's important to know that nobody can heal anyone else, okay? Nobody is a healer. you have to do your own work. And so I think people get caught up in this idea that I'm going to go out, I'm going to change the world, I'm going to heal this wound. That is a trap. So one, remember that if you're encountering someone that is clearly full of negativity in that moment, at that time, the intention is not to heal them and change them for any way, for that they already are. Two, a general sense of curiosity has been very important to me. Um, I'll give you just a quick anecdote. The other day, I was in a grocery store and they have their phones. They have their phones on the pillars, and I was like, "Oh, this is interesting." And I felt compelled to just pick up the phone, put the speaker on, and just say over the big intercom over the whole grocery store, "Thank you for shopping here. I hope you have a wonderful day." And that was it. And that was it. And when we got to the register, I told the lady, I said, I learned how to speak over the intercom. And keep in mind, I'm not an employee here, but I told her I
Mm.
learned to speak out of the intercom. And, just asking her, "Oh, what do you think of that?" Or what are your thoughts? Or how are you feeling? And she said, "Oh, I'm not having such a good day." And just, "Oh, well, why not?" You know, I
Mm.
think a lot of people will stop right there or say something like, "Oh, it'll get better. It'll get better." Um, but that genuine curiosity of, "Whoa, why aren't you having a bad day?" "Oh, this and that, this and that." And then, she's got a listener. And
Ah.
so there's
Mhm.
someone that's actually able to listen, and she can somewhat process that in a sense. And so that does take energy for the individual, though. For me, it took energy, but that's okay. Um, so that becomes another game in and of itself, is how to manage your energy, how to create healthy boundaries, a big
Mhm.
challenge in and of itself. But yeah, a genuine sense of curiosity um, is has been really useful. And then just giving loving kindness or metta, even just cognitively saying, "Oh, this person is clearly having a bad day. May he or she, um, be happy. May she or he just get a break from whatever they're going through." And it's kind of a fake it till you make it situation. It sounds contrived, but
Uh-huh.
eventually it works. So those are just some practical things that I do when encountering negativity. Or sometimes if it's just something I don't want to deal with, then I will just avoid it. That's also part of it.
Mm.
Making sure I'm hanging out and surrounding myself with people that are embodying similar values as me, and setting my life up that way. Um, People that are going to lift me up and support me rather than people that are going to bring me down. So sometimes people just need to be let go of, in that sense, or avoided.
Yeah, I imagine that's a problem everyone has, or maybe not a problem, but a situation that everyone's encountering or could relate to, in that, we want to keep our old friends in a way. Like, we want to love everyone. There's some part of us that wants that attention, or wants to be loyal, right? Um, but also respects the fact that maybe this situation isn't best for me. And so, yeah, I guess, how do you balance those two? Like, in a way, like loyalty versus independence.
Well, so realistically, we have 24 hours in a day, right? We only have so much energy to give. And relationships take a lot of energy. They take, an intimate relationship being kind of the apex of that takes a lot of energy to maintain. But even just friendships also take a lot of energy to maintain. And So if there is a relationship or a friendship that is clearly not working, or that there's some sort of dissonance or disconnect, then it helps one to really evaluate, okay, I'm spending this energy on this friendship, but this person is not supporting me, and I've done this and that. Um, really looking at it honestly and continually, I can't stress this enough, but continually pointing the finger back at yourself. Okay,
Mm,
is my what is my role in this situation right now? In whatever argument or tension that there is in the friendship, what is my role in this? And really figuring that out, what your role in it is, and correcting that first. And
mm,
then if this person is still um, just not getting it, or whatever it is, then it's time to move on. Um, but I think that's important, is to continually do the work inside. And in most situations, I think these relationships fall off naturally as we become more skilled at observing ourselves inside and really continually evaluating what's going on with us. Um, but yeah, it's not easy, because then you bring communication into it as well. I want to be skillful in my communication. I don't want to just disband a friendship um, by
mm.
ignoring them. I want to have the dialogue. Look, this is what you're doing. This is what I've been trying to do. I haven't seen this kind of effort from you, et cetera, pointing out objective things. At this point, I think it's time, if we just, for now, break off communication with each other. Um, and those are hard. Those are hard situations to come into, because, like you said, you run into habit patterns like, I want to be loyal. I want to be liked by them. I want to be loved by them. I want, whatever it is that you're getting out of that relationship.
Mhm.
So it's not easy. It's not easy, but like many things, you jump into something that is challenging and takes effort, you're going to come out the other side of a bigger person for it, and a more wise person for it.
Yeah, yeah. I really like the way you frame that, in that like we have our own autonomy, we have our own power when it comes to those situations. And like you said, pointing the finger back at yourself. I think that's super important. And I heard this quote the other day that was like, when you point, like let's say you're blaming someone, right? When you point the finger at someone else, there's three fingers pointing back at you. And so it's like we always have the answers and the control necessary to enact change and yeah, I guess free ourselves from that self-imposed suffering. But like you said, there's so many detailed elements of like communication. They're also very difficult but necessary.
Yeah, it's true. It's a big soup of variables that I think meditating helps to see that soup a little clearly, and to figure out which ingredient is going where, how is this going to make a difference here. Yeah, but communication is huge. It's huge for any sort of interactive work that you're trying to do, or if you have toxic relationships, um, or have habit patterns where you just allow yourself to get walked all over. That's something to face. That's challenging, just to create those boundaries. So
Yeah, yeah, that's good. Very cool.
but I will say it can be playful. It can be a game as well. In a way, I'm trying to level up as much as I can. I'm trying to push on my edges as much as I can. And the more that I practice, the more that I push on these edges, the more I'm comfortable doing it. So I'm more comfortable with uncomfortable situations, knowing that, and again, it's this grain by grain experience. I come out the other side and realize, oh, I now have this little bit of wisdom with me that I can draw on and give me strength for the next challenge, whatever that is. So it's a
Yeah.
momentum game. It's definitely a momentum game, and that beginning part, getting that momentum started, is very scary, very challenging, um, but definitely worth it. Definitely worth it in whatever aspect of your life you're looking to make progress in.
Yeah, I think that's super important to mention, just the momentum aspect of life. Um, because at times it can feel like, I know for me, when bad things happen or things that I don't want to have happened, it's like if I let that take me over, it just builds and builds and builds into even more like suffering and more depression or whatever you want to call it. Um, Whereas those good things, you know, whether that's connecting with ourselves, um, or like sharing meta with ourselves or giving it to others, like those things also accumulate in our best interest. And so I think that's uh, super important.
Yeah, well said.
All right, well, I mean, there's so many directions we could go in.
Just pick one. Let's talk.
Yeah, I mean, I guess I kind of like to get your thoughts on the no self idea of meditation. Like there's this theoretical and practical idea, I guess, that there is no self. Um, there is no, and we don't mean that, I get, so this is an Eastern philosophy or like a Buddhist idea. And what they don't mean necessarily is like there isn't not a body. Like we do have a body, we are here, this is reality. But I wanted to get your thoughts on what your conception of no self is, and if you've experienced something like that. Because for like, and I'll let you know the way I understand it, which is just when you're sitting, I guess, in meditation and you're shutting off your visual fields, like you're shutting off that sense door and only exploring the inside of your body, that there is nothing to hold on to. And so if you go looking for a self, or like you begin to think, who am I? And you begin to inspect into that and start looking around inside, as soon as you turn your attention to the inside, it just becomes too overwhelming and too complex. And you realize, like, I don't know where I am necessarily. Like, I can't pinpoint where I am. And I guess it's further reinforced in like neuroscience, right? Like this idea that they haven't been able to pinpoint a certain region of the brain where the self exists, or where consciousness exists. So how do you experience that, and what do you think that idea means to you? Like this idea that there is no self.
Well, I think it helps to first say that there are different levels of reality. So we have an ultimate reality, which is that no self, that where the laws are in their perfect form. So impermanence, suffering, and no self, if we're going to get into a little bit of the Buddhist philosophy, those are the three fundamental laws. And so at its ultimate reality, impermanence is the flickering of all the particles and wavelets around us, that nothing is solid, oscillating in and out at trillions and trillions and trillions of times per second. That is the ultimate reality. Okay. And then anatta, no self, how I understand it is essentially that everything is just arising and passing away, and that there's no person that it's happening to. This is all just phenomena, mental and material phenomena arising and passing away. There's no David, that you're just a conglomerate, an aggregation of all of these phenomena together that we call David. And even that is changing. Um,
Mm.
it's just appearing. It's just appearing as cause and effect, and is how I'm understanding it. But on a more mundane level, we do have a self, right? So I do have a personality, and this personality is changing, but I do identify as Bradley, in a mundane sense. And then somewhere in the middle, when I'm practicing, trying to seek ultimate reality or trying to experience that ultimate reality, is somewhere in the middle where there's nowhere. Well, for me, my sense of self is somewhere, and for a lot of people, I think, is somewhere like behind the eyes or the forehead or something, where that's where the locus of self is. But like you said, there's so much complexity going on. There's so much change going on within the body in any individual moment. It's really hard to say that this body is me. There's a point that it's coming from where I think it's me, but it's tough. I mean, that's the final nugget of wisdom that comes right before liberation, is
Mm.
this full realization of no self. And um, I still intellectually struggle with that truth, and experientially as well, with no self. But
Yeah.
for mundane purposes, I really think it would be a step in the wrong direction to think that there's no there's no self, even if you're identifying as yourself. I mean, your reality, my reality is that I'm Bradley, right?
Hmm.
And so that's just the way it is right now. But there's states of consciousness, some might call it flow. There's other states of consciousness where it's like there's something moving me. It's not Bradley. I'm just becoming an instrument. And that could also be perceived in a way as no self, where that idea of Bradley simply fades away, and now there's just experience. So that gap between me experiencing it and the experience itself starts to close in on itself to where it's just experience. And
Mm.
it's happening moment to moment to moment, with without the thought, but it's just happening. And there's no Bradley experiencing it. It's just an experience that's happening.
Yeah. Yeah, that's super interesting because I've been really curious about the commonalities, the similarities, and the differences between flow and mindfulness. And like, do they coexist? Are they separate things? Because like you're saying, right, everyone enters into flow states at some point in their lives, like, just studying for a test. You forget all about who you are. Um, you forget to eat. Like these things just don't come to mind. And or like artists painting, right? We can spend hours painting, creating, and we forget who we are. Um, but that's like, and so that is one experience, right, of no self. But if one enters into a flow state, I wonder also, like, have they lost their mindfulness? Which is, I guess, defined more or less as like the awareness of your being, of your reality that's unfolding. And so in one way, right, we're like lost in the flow, but and so we've also like lost our mindfulness, right? But do I don't know. I'm getting confused myself, but do you
No,
think
no, no.
those two things? Yeah.
I think you're right on. I think being in a flow state doesn't necessitate being mindful in any way. However, I think that you can be in a flow state and mindful.
Mm,
So I think you can be in a flow state and still aware of what's going on in your body, still be aware of the impermanence of it all. I think that they can coexist, but simply being in a flow state doesn't mean that you're mindful. You could just be on a really productive autopilot mode, and that could be considered flow state in a sense. Um, but to be in a flow state with that mindfulness, I think is powerful. Um, and I
yeah,
guess
I
it
think
begs to
so.
differ. Are you in the flow state if you're aware? Because if I'm aware that it's all changing, but I'm still embodied,
Hmm.
then no, it's a good question.
Yeah, that's what I wonder about too, and it makes me think that they can't coexist. Like they're almost two different things. Although there have been moments, I guess, in like my meditation where it does seem effortless. It does seem like it has some of the qualities of flow, but maybe not all of them, I guess. And so
Hmm.
maybe they do overlap, but from an intellectual standpoint, but maybe they are two different things.
Yeah, they may be. I'm not exactly sure. I will say though, when I'm in, I guess, somewhat of a flow state, there is a there is a part of my mind that is telling me what to do, and it's a very soft voice in my mind, and it doesn't generally say it more than once, but it'll say, "Why don't you do this?" And then I'll go do that, super successful. And why don't you do this? Whereas there's other voices in my head that will pester and repeat, and those voices I try not to follow and try and look at. But there is like a gentle voice that if I'm available to listen to it, available um, to follow it, it generally turns out quite well. And I think that that is the wholesome part of my mind that
Mm,
is operating, um, as opposed to the unwholesome.
yeah, and
It's more
yeah,
intuitive.
really
It's more
cool.
intuitive. Um,
Mm,
I think one of the great benefits of self-observation is that the internal compass starts to get cleaned off. There's so many layers of rust and dirt on it that we really don't know what we're doing. We're a lot of the times just operating on a purely cognitive level and not using all of these other senses that we have, especially like tactile senses around our heart, in these areas that can be very useful when making practical decisions, as opposed to just cognitively weighing the decision, with what little information we have. And so as we practice more, we start to peel those layers of dust and rust off of our internal compass and operate from a completely different level of our decision making. Yes, there's some cognitive ability to that decision making and weight, but there's a lot more intuition and internal sensing about what the right decision is, um, because there's so much more information going on inside the body than just what we can think of cognitively when making decisions in our lives.
mm. Yeah, that's super interesting because what is the theory in Buddhism, I guess, that there's six senses, right? And so we have the five senses that everyone would normally associate with sight, smell, touch, taste, hearing, but then there's also like the sixth sense, the mind. And so what you're saying in a way is like the mind is only one sense, but for most of us, it's the strongest sense. It's the one we associate most with and get lost in the most, but that these other bodily senses can be um, listened more, or I guess like tuned into a little bit more? Or would you say that
Yeah.
the inner voice or that intuition that you're speaking about, is that also still part of the mind sense? It's just like a fragmented piece of it, you think?
Well, I think that especially the tactile sense, the sense of touch, becomes a lot more useful, um, what we're feeling. But also, maybe a lot of listeners have had experiences where someone will say something and they might say a bunch of things, and then you might just catch a few words or a fragment of a sentence, and that part really resonates with you. Um, and that can become very useful. So, but the more we pay attention and ground ourselves in this tactile sense of our body, the more these other senses start to light up too, and new information starts coming in as well. Um, and again, our mind will get on board as well. As our mind gets more and more purified, our thoughts become more wholesome too. So using that cognitive ability is still very useful. Um, Using our body though is feeling what's going on becomes just an added tool to decision making, which we all have to do. So even if one isn't keen on liberation from the wheel of life and death, or doesn't believe any of this, even just from a purely pragmatic sense, if you have more information available to you, you're going to generally make a better decision because you have a bigger picture of the situation you're dealing with. But if
Mm,
you are
yeah.
just operating on what you think about a situation, what your perception is of the situation, without any sort of grounding in your body, like what are you actually seeing, what are you actually hearing, um, without more objective information, then you're bound to make some, you know, unstable decisions based on what is really a very blurry picture.
Mm, yeah. So these senses are basically information sources that,
Absolutely.
and I see them as like like, for instance, I think this is part of my journey with just being like sobriety in general. And for instance, when we take substances like alcohol or caffeine, one's numbing our senses, right? We're becoming desensitized to these information sources. And then caffeine, for instance, or at least on me, like I go crazy. Like I get super spastic and it's just so much sensation that I'm like overwhelming the information sources. And I think it helps me, I guess, to really feel into those and not tune them out because it's already hard enough to listen to them just being sober, right? It's already a challenge.
Right.
Um, and so yeah, do you feel like you've had that same experience? Like it's helping you, and like that's part of the reason why you don't take substances, and that is helping you to feel into the body.
Absolutely. I just, the whole path that I'm on is going from gross to subtle, and many of these substances fog the mind, engross the mind. So to me, just from a purely intellectual level, it's completely counterproductive to the path that I'm on, where I'm trying to get more and more sensitive to things, and that's not going to be aided and abetted by any substances. So it's really challenged me to look at the substances I'm taking because, of course, everything I'm eating is having some sort of chemical interaction with my sense doors, and so really just looking at that and finding a way to eliminate what is engrossing my mind in a balanced way. That's piecemeal. That's what I mean to say. That's piecemeal. I
Mm.
think I used to just jump off the end and just completely eliminate something, and that's useful sometimes. Everyone's got their own strategy for incorporating new positive habits into their life. But again, balance is the key. So one thing that I'm definitely looking to eliminate entirely and on is sugar. I just find that with sugar, my I'm just, it's like caffeine. It's my mind goes
Same.
totally,
Yeah.
yeah, and the more I experience that with sugar, I get a little more wisdom so that maybe next time I can make a stronger choice or, you know,
Mm.
but
Yeah, and
sometimes elimination is the strategy. Sometimes I have to just take it out entirely and create a whole new structure to develop a new habit pattern because I need that structural support to create it. And then as I get that habit pattern, I can relinquish or flex that structure a little, um, to just allow a little flexibility. That if I'm at a dinner and someone's created a nice dessert and it's got a little sugar in it, then I'm okay. I can say, yeah, let's have a piece of that pie. That's not gonna push me into, drowning 12 donuts down after, that I feel more
uh,
comfortable with that. Um, so it's this constant tug of war between, the mundane and the super mundane and the ultimate quest and how that balances with a bunch of individual variables. It's just fascinating to be in this game and to learn how to play it more and more skillfully.
yeah, yeah, that's great. And I
Yeah.
think I think part of it too is like what well, I also want to clarify my own words because I don't want to sound like I'm judging anyone who's drinking or smoking or drinking caffeine because like I have my own vices, right? Like you said, sugar. And often these behaviors are just transferring from one thing to the next. Like we might cut out something in one aspect of our life, but that addiction is merely funneled into some other avenue. So I think that's important for me to state, but also um, that oh man, I lost my train of thought. But
Well, it's true that I also don't mean to belittle anyone who's struggling with these things because I know for a fact you and I both have been down those roads,
uh
and we're struggling with it too. So yeah, it's not a judgment call in any stretch. It's just moving past that cycle the best we can.
yeah, and oh, so I remember what I was gonna say. Also, was like when it comes to making those small mundane decisions, right? Like oh, there's a piece of pie in front of me that's been offered to me. I think it's also super important to to recognize the self abuse that you might be giving yourself, and seeing if that might be even more hurtful or disruptive or harmful to yourself than the eating of the pie in general. So if you're just going to be like, if you're belittling yourself for eating it afterwards, like you are compounding the suffering that that you would otherwise just be a momentary, fleeting, pleasurable experience. So I think that's important also to recognize,
I agree, dude.
not to layer on to those behaviors.
And if you do layer that on, to recognize that one's layering that on and that regretful feeling sucks. And so remembering that the next time you get the pie in front of you, um, that sucks,
Mm,
and that
yeah.
the pie is going to last for like 2 minutes, and the regret is going to last a lot longer than that.
hmm
But that's not to mean that the pie is bad, that the pie is inherently bad. Sometimes that's what it takes to balance the mind a little. If you're pushing hard and you're working hard and you're just, renouncing all of these things, and then someone offers you a slice of pie, well, that could be what takes you into that balancing mode. So,
Yeah. Well, cool. I guess one question I had for you was, right, so you've been doing this for 3 years, living the monk life. I'm sure it hasn't been easy at some point, at many points. And, the questions arise, like, should I be doing this? Should I be living in the world? Have there been points when you've like wanted to quit or like wanted to give up and just pursue a career, or are those just very fleeting, or do those thoughts stay with you? What's that internal dialogue like?
well, let me just clarify that I wouldn't consider myself living an entirely monastic lifestyle. I'd say it's semi-monastic. There are certain things I'm abiding by and some things that are a little looser. But yeah, of course, I am in an isolated situation right now, and I do think about the mundane things at times. What kind of livelihood I'd like to pursue, perhaps a partner in the future, things like this. And those are all weighed in between really my quest for final liberation and the ending of suffering for me. So each of those has a weight to it, and those weights toggle at times and oscillate where one might be more predominant than the other. At this moment, I feel pretty strongly about going out into the world in some ways, or rather leaving where I'm at the end of the year and doing a little more serious practice on my own, and then figuring out how I can incorporate that into a mundane life. I don't foresee myself taking on robes or anything like that, but I think there's some things that I'd like to accomplish before coming back into the world and setting that up, whatever that looks like. But the more I practice, David, and people might be inspired by this, is that I feel much more confident in setting up my life on my terms the more I practice. And that means scheduling, that means what I'm doing, that means how much of it I am doing. All of these variables I feel much more in control of the more that I practice self-observation, because I know that I'm not willing to give up certain things that are important to me, and that certain things become negotiable and certain things become non-negotiable. And the practice just develops a person in so many ways. I mean, it's all around. It's just a constant balancing act. The practice will expose your weaknesses and ask you to address them. And in that process of pain and suffering, of addressing those weaknesses, one comes out the other side a completely different person.
So
that's very exciting.
Yeah, it is.
Yeah.
And so that's what I want to ask you about. Like, what weaknesses have been exposed from you, and like what pain and suffering had you had to go through to find those weaknesses? Because I think that's one thing everyone can understand, or needs help, or at least I know I need help, like under realizing that these lessons, right? These exposing of our weaknesses and what we can learn, they lie on the other side of suffering and pain. And a lot of us at times aren't willing to push through that to experience, to really hit that low, basically, and to gain that insight. And so, like, what weaknesses have you seen the practice exposing yourself?
one big one that comes to mind is a weakness in being vulnerable. So I definitely find a lot of value in being vulnerable, and the practice has exposed how guarded I am around people and even friends. So it's exposed that weakness and really challenged me to open up and be vulnerable with people. And this has led into a bunch of different journeys where, okay, how do I articulate what I'm feeling and how do I express this to another person so that so that we can connect more, that
Mm.
they can have a better understanding of what my experience is and vice versa. So that has been huge, just learning how to be more vulnerable with people. Very scary to express how one's feeling truly, and to even attempt the journey of articulating how one's feeling and why they're feeling that way, what their needs are, what my needs are. So being more vulnerable allows me to communicate what I'm feeling and also express my needs, and which is tough. I mean,
Hmm.
especially in what I was indoctrinated in, where, men, you don't have needs. You just you just pile it on, push it
Just
down, and
get her
keep going,
done.
man. Just
Just
keep
keep going.
going. And but that's not healthy, and it's not a sustainable strategy to do that. So
Mm.
being vulnerable was a weakness that I'm getting much better at and have seen leaps and bounds in. Um, Another weakness that's exposed is my extreme attitude. Uh, it's it was generally very black or white. If I was going into something, I was going into it at 100 miles an hour and losing the balance of my mind. And now I can move into those spaces, or make changes in some might think is extreme, but with much more poise and much more research behind it, and really not this just blind running into the wall, but rather walking over to the wall, understanding, okay, I'm at this wall, and this is going to be good for me to get to this wall, because then I can start backtracking and find that middle. Um,
Mm.
so that's another weakness that was exposed, and I've gotten much better at making changes. Um, and probably a third weakness, just to tie it together, is that everything was about me. What a weakness that is, when I think that the world is revolving around me, that everything is about me. And so that all the attention needs to be on me, that I need to be this, that, this. And this goes in the other direction too. So this is my ego that wants attention, but some people's ego is pushing attention away, and it's the other end. But don't be
Mm.
fooled. That's still the ego, and that's still a trap. So for me, it's been learning how to let the light shine on others, giving others more attention, listening more, um, these kinds of activities. Where for some people who are avoiding things, their challenge might be speaking up a little more, drawing a little more attention in. So those are some weaknesses that have been exposed. And eating
Wow.
habits, just
Yeah.
as a practical level, eating habits, big time
Hmm.
exposure with the practice. It's just so clear with what we're inputting in our body. And once I start feeling more sensitive with what's in my body, okay, I need to make some changes. And so that's another weakness that's been exposed.
Well, yeah, we can talk about that one a little bit more though, because you've made some pretty big changes when it comes to your eating habits. Do you want to talk about what the practices you've adopted there are like? I know you've discussed with me kind of your one meal a day approach, and so are you still doing that? And what is that like? And finally, I guess, why would one only eat one meal a day? Like, what are the benefits of that?
Cool. Yeah, I like talking about this. That's true. I just eat one meal a day, and I generally eat dinner. I find that dinner is usually a social. There's usually most social events revolve around dinner that I find, and so by eating dinner, I I'm not sacrificing social events. But I'm also a little more flexible with it now. I think I've been doing it for 6 to 8 months now, a meal a day, and I originally adopted this strategy along with some fasting because I was, like you said, when you give up one addiction, it gets transferred to another. So living in the environment that I am in a meditation center where a lot of stimulus is simply not there. Um, so one stimuli that is there though is food. So that
Mm.
was getting transferred to food. My addictions were getting funneled into food, and I was finding I was eating a lot. I was generally feeling very heavy and bloated, um, and just eating much more than I thought I needed to, but really not able to come out of it and feeling like I didn't have a choice. You put that pie in front of me, there's no question I'm going to eat that pie. If you put
Uh-huh.
another slice, I'll eat that too.
Hmm.
And so it was exposing it in a big way, and I had to get a handle on it. So for me, creating structure is very important. Um, and usually just eliminating something entirely will help me reset. So I started fasting and did like a couple of 5-day fasts. Uh, and that just reset me in a sense that it reset my eating habit patterns. And I started to experiment more and more and realized, okay, that was maybe a little on the extreme. It was good for me at the time, but I think I can find a middle
Sustainable.
path here. Yeah,
Mm.
exactly. And so I started doing some more research and found that there's this whole movement of people doing one meal a day. And for me, the monks generally eat one meal a day. So that was also an attractive factor to it. So I just gave it a shot, and um, it's been great. So I basically work throughout the entire day on, essentially kind of an empty stomach, and then I eat in the evening. And
Mm.
and in the beginning, they were large meals. But as I've continued to practice this, it's become much more balanced. And I'd say some benefits are that my body is now very efficient with what's coming in. I think before I was eating a lot, and it might grab some nutrients out of here, some nutrients out of here, and just be like, all right, take it to the shitter. We got to get this out of here. There's more coming in soon.
Hmm.
Um,
Mm.
but now my body really, it's trained. It knows that, okay, this is just happening once today. We have to really get as much as we can out of this. And so that's been wonderful because I'm able to basically get by with less food. So that's cheaper. That's financially beneficial. My energy levels for the first few weeks, it'd be a little lull in the afternoon, but after a while, after the body learns to metabolize fat instead of glucose, then then it starts adapting, and I'm able to work hard throughout the day and then just eat in the evening. And you wouldn't believe how productive one can be when. So in the beginning, the mind was like, "Oh, I'm so excited for tonight. Gonna get my one meal," and I'd be wasting energy that way thinking about that meal in the evening, right? But
Hmm.
that fades. That fades away, and I just can't believe how much time I spent eating or thinking about eating before, which is now diverted into much more productivity. I can get a lot done with my time, and feel that I've really earned that meal at the end of the day. Um, that there's that at this point, yeah, I'm hungry now. I want to eat. I'm not just eating to eat. Um,
Mm.
so besides meditation, I think it's been one of the most powerful practices for me, and it couples well with meditation because anyone who starts to meditate and observe their sensations realizes that the physical input is a big part of the sensations that you feel. And so that's been that's been nice, a lot less heaviness, and more clarity, much more clarity. Um,
Yeah.
so coming out of that substance abuse with food, which I challenge people to think about what they're eating, and that think about it as a substance. It's changing the chemistry of your body, and just like anything else, it's worth looking at what's going in the body.
Yeah, well said. So with that diet, you said the body is basically processing fat over glucose. So are you eating fat heavy one meals, like a lot of guacamole or avocado, or are you drinking olive oils, or like how are you getting in those fats? And
Yeah,
what would be an example of like a meal?
it's a good question. So, um, the monks generally, when they're begging for food, they'll get their food, they'll go around and take their alms, and they'll just mix it all up. They'll just mix all their food up, and then they'll eat that. And so I developed that as well, where I'll get some leftovers from the center and maybe supplement that from the meditation center, that is, and then supplement that with an avocado, some greens, kind of just whatever's available, whatever I feel like, some vegetables, and yeah, there's be some olive oil in there, generally some nuts or something. I do eat a lot of fat, but that aspect of where I was basically ketogenic, not in a strict sense, but like 60 to 70% fat calories and the rest of it carbohydrate or protein, is loosened up a lot. I find that because I'm eating just one meal a day, I can be a little more flexible with what's coming in my body as far as carbohydrate, fat, and protein. Um, so it's all three of those are involved generally, but I'm I'm not nitpicking like I was in the beginning. Again, back to that. For me, my strategy is a lot of structure in the beginning. Once I get
Mm,
comfortable, I relax and just start to understand the principles of what I'm doing, the essence of what I'm doing, rather than the intellectual aspects of it and the strong structure with it. Um,
yeah.
and that's awesome. That's a journey for people. I mean, if they want change in their life, that's a really powerful tip to create some serious structure. Make a dedicated intention to try it out. Generally, if you're making any new big habit change, I'd give it at least 3 months to see how you're feeling before and after, and mark what kind of changes are happening with your mind and body, whatever that is for you.
Yeah, and I think that's something I really struggle with is like that structure, but I think that it's so important. Like I haven't read his book, but are you familiar with Jocko Willink? He has I think he's
Total, was
a
it? This is Navy SEAL.
Navy
Yeah,
SEAL, right? Yeah, he has a
yeah.
book, Discipline Equals Freedom.
Mm,
And so basically what you're saying is very much in line with that, like create the structure, create the discipline, and continue to pursue that until the freedom comes to then evaluate and really understand why it is that you're doing these things and go from there.
I like that. That's discipline is freedom. That's a good
Hmm.
point.
All right. Well, what else? What else do you think? Is there anything that you wanted to bring up that we haven't talked about yet?
Um, I don't know, I guess I'm curious about your audience and what might be useful. I know we got into some maybe deeper aspects of meditation, and maybe some of your
Hmm.
audience isn't meditating. Um, just curious about what we can talk about that could be of practical, a more practical
Yeah.
use to your audience.
Well, I guess we can. because I do think we dove a little bit deeply into technique and philosophy a little bit. So, what would you say to people who might think you're a little bit crazy, like going in and, like you said, living like a semi-monastic monk life? Um, because you have had to sacrifice a lot to live this life. So, I guess why are you doing it? And like what would you say to someone who's might be curious about um, either learning more about meditation or attending their first retreat? What would you say to them about those things?
Well, if someone is curious about attending a retreat, and I'd say that's a good thought. That's a good thought to cultivate, and that there is a reason why you are curious about it. This whole path that I've been on, and I think many can attest to, others on this path, is really a process of letting go. And so that starts from the very gross to the very subtle. So I remember when I was in my early 20s, I started to let go of things. I started to let go of like clothes, just a bunch of stuff that I didn't use anymore. Um, so that's a good exercise to me, for people who aren't meditating yet, but are curious about it, or just wanting to declutter their life, find more clarity, and maybe simplify, is to look at the gross level. What's in your house? Jordan Peterson talks about this. Clean your room. Clean
Mm-hmm.
your room.
Mm-hmm.
Because that leads into a bunch of different tributaries in your life. And it asks you to really evaluate those things and reflect upon those things and then be ready to let it go. I mean, if I start cleaning my room, or if you start, or anyone starts, they're going to start finding things that's going to have some story, some aspect of them that they're holding on to. And then you can reflect on that. Okay, I'm ready to give that part of me up. Let's get rid of this. Let's get rid of this. Let's get rid of this. And so, like that, piecemeal, start getting rid of things and simplifying your life the best you can. This is going to help your mind and body in so many ways, especially your mind. Um, and then that intention, that's what I would say, David, is the intention to do these things is going to be the driving factor. And if you have an intention to have a clear mind, if you have an intention to be happier, if you have an intention to do any of these things, then state it to yourself out loud, whatever you need to do, and then ask yourself, why do I have this intention? What are the reasons that I have this intention that are going to bolster this intention and give it more energy to be able to see it through? So I want to be happy. Well, why do I want to be happy? Well, because being miserable sucks. I can't contribute as much to people when I'm in a state of misery or sadness. Um, I can't thrive, or why do I want to thrive? Well, here's why, et cetera, et cetera.
Mm-hmm.
So I'd say an intention, the motivation with reasons behind it. You get more reasons behind something, then there's going to be more energy behind that intention.
Yeah.
Um, yeah, but yeah, so practically start simplifying, I'd say, if you're really interested in this path, start simplifying your life, um, and spending your time wisely. Log how you're spending your time for a few days and see where are you wasting your time. Find out where are you hurting yourself, essentially. You said that earlier. Like, where are you hurting yourself? How you're spending your time. Are you numbing yourself by watching 3 hours of television a day? And again, there's nothing inherently wrong with television or any of these things that we're mentioning, but when you take something to an extreme and are doing so much of it, then it starts to hurt.
Mm.
Um, and keep in mind that everything is influencing our mind. Everything is influencing our mind. So what kind of input are you giving your mind? We talked about one meal a day and food input, but what kind of input are you giving your mind? Are you scrolling through Facebook for 2 hours a day, just with nothing very useful on it? Are you Where can you really adjust, make those adjustments and start small, gain momentum so you can make bigger changes. Um,
Mm,
and just as a simple one, even if you don't meditate, stop and just observe your breath. Okay, I'm alive. I'm breathing. Okay. Just take 10 seconds. I remember them teaching this to us in school. You're angry, count down from 10. Count down from 10 and just breathe. Little practical tips like this may seem small and trivial, but when extrapolated out over time, they can be quite powerful.
yep.
Yep.
Well, all right, man. We've covered a lot. There's still a lot more to cover. We really didn't get to discuss much of any of the trail. But maybe that's another conversation for another time.
That
Yeah.
that would be a fun one. That'd be a fun one.
Yeah, I think that'd be worth it for sure. So we'll have to have you back on to discuss some maybe personal stories and discuss more of our weaknesses that we've come to see more clearly in ourselves. So yeah, thank you for sharing those with us and your story and what you've been learning. Really appreciate your time.
Yeah, well, thank you for the opportunity. I hope that this inspires people in some way, shape, or form to just keep walking the best that they can. I think at this particular juncture in the world that we need people to start stepping up, and I think that's what's happening, and I'm seeing it all around. So I hope that this inspires that movement forward. And you, good luck, David, with this podcast. You and I keep in close contact with each other, so I'm sure I'll be seeing you or talking to you soon. But
Mm-hmm.
yeah,
Yeah, we'll do round two soon. But in the meantime, if people do want to get in touch with you, I know you're not active on the social medias. Can they email you, or what would be a good way to get in touch with you?
yes, they can email me. I welcome that. My email is bradley.j.lovell@gmail.com. That's BradleyJLOV as in Victor, ELL @gmail.com. Yeah.
All right, Bradley. Thank you, my
All right,
brother.
brother. Yeah, I'll talk to you soon, bro.
All right. Well, that was the conversation. But before you go, please let me know your feedback in regards to this episode. How can I improve? How can I do better? What did you think of the format? What did you think of the discussion topics? What would you like to hear more of next time if we can get Bradley back on the podcast? And if you'd like to receive essays that I write or stories, head on over to my blog at thinkingwithdavid.com, which might be walkingwithdavid.com in the future if you're listening to this at some later day. So check both of those domains out. And then finally, if this is on iTunes, which I'm assuming that's where you're listening to it from, please give us 5 stars and give an honest review of what you thought about our discussion. I think this is the best way for other people to discover the podcast in the future. All right, you guys. Thank you so much for listening, and have a great day. Bye.